The colonel humiliated her in front of everyone, but seconds later, she did the unthinkable. They thought she'd cry. They thought she'd collapse like the others before her. But instead, this quiet female recruit stood up soaking wet, shaking but with fire in her eyes. And in that moment, she didn't just earn their respect, she changed the entire base. This is not just a story about military humiliation, it's about unexpected leadership, resilience, and how one woman's strength in silence shook an entire system. Before we continue, drop a comment where in the world are you watching from. We'd love to see how far this story reaches. And don't forget to hit subscribe, because this story is just getting started. Avery Knox had never fit the mold. Raised by a single father in a rusted-out trailer on the outskirts of Helena, Montana. She learned early on that life doesn't hand out second chances. While others her age were applying to colleges or posting selfies, Avery was running laps through snowstorms and working night shifts at a truck stop, anything to toughen herself for what was coming. At just 19, she enlisted in the military, not to prove anything to anyone, but because she needed purpose. She arrived at Camp Redwood, one of the most unforgiving training facilities in the country. It was run by Colonel Mason, a stone-faced commander known for breaking recruits down mentally before ever letting them hold a rifle. From the start. Avery stood out, but not in the way she hoped. Her quiet focus made others uneasy, and her sighs invited whispers. The other recruits called her Ghost Girl because she never talked back and never cried, no matter how brutal the drills became. But the moment that would define Avery wasn't during a test or a mission. It came unexpectedly on a gray morning when a bucket of water changed everything. It was the 5th day of Hell Week at Camp Redwood, a grueling stretch where recruits were stripped of sleep, comfort, and any illusion that military life would ever be easy. The skies were steel gray that morning, and the cold bit hard through the fabric of their damp uniforms. Mud clung to their boots like cement, and no one dared speak unless spoken to. The platoon was assembled in formation after a 3-mile forced march, breathing heavy, shoulders sagging. Colonel Mason paced in front of them, eyes scanning like a hawk. His voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Some of you think you can survive in the field just because you made it to day 5. He barked. But surviving is about more than muscles or medals. It's about mental fire. And right now, some of you are flickering out. His eyes landed on Avery Knox. "You step forward." Avery did as told, her expression unreadable. "You think you're tough, Private Knox?" the colonel asked, voice cold. "No, sir," she replied calmly. He narrowed his eyes. "Then let's test that." Without warning, he turned, grabbed a steel bucket filled with icy water set there deliberately for this very moment, and dumped it straight over her head. The entire platoon gasped. Water cascaded down her face, soaking her fatigues. The shock of the cold sucked the air from her lungs. But Avery didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She didn't wipe her face. Colonel Mason stepped closer, daring her to crack. "You're wet, you're cold, and you've just been humiliated in front of every single recruit here. Still think you belong in my army." A long silence followed, the kind that stretches thin like glass, ready to shatter. Then Avery straightened her spine, locked eyes with the colonel, and said, loud enough for the whole base to hear, "Permission to speak, sir." Colonel Mason raised an eyebrow. "Granted." She took a breath. Her voice didn't waver. "I didn't come here to be dry, sir. I came here to be dangerous." The air shifted. It was subtle, like a current had moved through the crowd. A few recruits exhaled in disbelief. Others stared in awe. Colonel Mason's face didn't change, but the silence that followed spoke volumes. "Back in formation," he said gruffly. Avery returned to her spot. Soaked, shivering, but standing taller than anyone else in that line. From that moment on, the atmosphere changed. Recruits who had whispered behind her back now watched her with quiet respect. Some even started mimicking her focus, her discipline. She had become something unexpected, a standard, an example. Later that evening, as they gathered for field drills, one of the squad leaders, Sergeant Leo Ramirez, a combat veteran with no patience for excuses, called her over. "You made a move today most wouldn't dare," he said, tossing her a fresh pair of gloves. "Tomorrow, your running point." Avery's eyes widened. Point was reserved for top performers, the ones trusted to lead formations through dangerous terrain. "But I'm not ready," she said instinctively. He smirked. "You said you didn't come here to be dry. Prove you came to lead." That night, Avery lay on her cot, the fabric still damp, her muscles aching. But inside her chest, something had shifted. It wasn't just about proving she belonged anymore. It was about becoming someone the rest could count on. And just like that, the girl they called Ghost Girl had become the heartbeat of the platoon. 3 days after the bucket incident, the air at Camp Redwood shifted. Recruits began pushing harder, standing straighter, and glancing toward Avery Knox more than they did their own squad leaders. She hadn't asked for respect, but she earned it. And sometimes, that's the most powerful kind. It was just after Tusora, when the sirens wailed through the base like a scream in the dark. Emergency simulation formation in 5. The recruits scrambled out of bed, pulling on boots with half-laced fingers, hearts racing. They knew this wasn't a drill. Colonel Mason never used that siren unless something big was coming. Avery's breath puffed into the cold as she tightened her vest and rushed outside, where searchlights sliced through the fog. 50 recruits stood blinking in the harsh light, boots crunching on gravel, adrenaline pounding in their veins. Colonel Mason stood before them, arms crossed, flanked by 2 senior officers. His face was unreadable. "Tonight," he said, voice booming, "we separate the soldiers from the shadows." He pointed to Avery. "You're leading Squad Delta." She blinked. "Sir, you heard me. Knox, you're in charge. Map, radio, flashlight. That's it." The other recruits in her squad, 4 of them, all bigger, older, and frankly skeptical, shifted uncomfortably. "1, Private Connor Briggs," muttered under his breath. "Babysitting duty great." Colonel Mason continued. "Each squad has been dropped at a different point in the woods. You'll navigate back using only the tools provided. No GPS, no help. Saboteurs will be planted along the route. You'll have 4 hours. Fail to return, and you're all recycled. Clear." The recruits shouted, "Yes, sir." Minutes later, Avery and her team were blindfolded and loaded into a truck. The ride was long, bumpy, and filled with tension thick enough to choke on. When the truck stopped, the blindfolds were yanked off. They were deep in the forest, alone. The cold wind howled through the pines, and darkness seemed to swallow the world whole. Avery pulled out the map, wet, crumpled, and marked with nothing but vague landmarks and coordinates. "Let's move," she said, voice steady. Briggs scoffed. "You seriously think we're letting you call the shots?" Avery didn't answer. She studied the stars, oriented the map, and took the lead. For the first hour, everything was tense but manageable. They followed a dry riverbed, crossed a broken bridge, and avoided barbed traps obviously set as obstacles. Then came the ambush. A flare lit up the sky, followed by shouting and blank gunfire. From behind a tree line, 2 fake enemy combatants emerged, masked and aggressive. One grabbed Private O'Hara, slamming him to the ground. Briggs panicked, dropped his gear, and ran. Avery didn't. Without hesitation, she lunged at the enemy, tackled him sideways, and wrestled him off O'Hara. The instructors posing as enemies were tough, trained, but they didn't expect her to fight back with that much fire. She held her ground until the flare died and the attackers retreated into the darkness. Their job done. O'Hara sat up, winded. You didn't hesitate. Avery helped him to his feet. Neither should you. 2 hours later, they emerged from the woods muddy, bruised, but alive. Even Briggs, who had been intercepted and forced to rejoin them by a training officer, looked at Avery with a new expression, respect. Colonel Mason was waiting. 4 squads didn't make it back. 3 lost a member. You didn't. He paused. You didn't just navigate the woods. You led in them. The recruit stood taller as he turned to address the rest of the base. Now gathered. Let it be known, Mason announced, Private Knox completed the midnight test with full marks and 0 casualties. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The midnight test was notoriously brutal, and no recruit had passed it in over 2 years. Avery didn't smile. She simply stood in the cold dawn, eyes sharp, heart calm. Because she knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The sun rose slowly over Camp Redwood the next morning, but it didn't feel like any ordinary day. Something had changed, not just in Avery Knox, but in the entire base. She wasn't Ghost Girl anymore. She was the one who came back. As the recruits gathered for morning drills, whispers trailed behind Avery like shadows. But this time, they weren't filled with mockery or doubt. They were laced with awe. Did you hear she took down 2 instructors? She didn't lose a single recruit. Mason actually praised her in front of everyone. In a place where silence was safer than compliments, those words meant everything. But the biggest shift didn't come from the whispers. It came from the way people started acting around her. Private Connor Briggs, who just days before had mocked her leadership, now waited for her cue during obstacle drills. He didn't say much, but his sudden attentiveness spoke volumes. Sergeant Ramirez, once cold and detached, now nodded in subtle approval when she passed by. And other recruits, many of whom had ignored her completely during the first week, now asked questions. Tactical questions, leadership advice, as if she'd already become one of them. But perhaps the most telling moment came during a meal in the mess hall. Avery sat alone, as usual, quietly eating her tray of overcooked eggs and stale toast. Then, without a word, Private Lily Archer, a tough-as-nails recruit from Boston, pulled out the chair beside her and sat down. "You still eat like you're invisible," Archer said, cracking open a juice carton. Avery looked up, unsure how to respond. Archer continued, "But you're not invisible anymore. Just thought someone should tell you." And just like that, the table filled. One by one, other recruits took seats near her, not to interrogate her, not to challenge her, but to be near her. For the first time since arriving, Avery realized she wasn't alone. She had a place, a presence. That afternoon, Colonel Mason called her into his office. It wasn't a place most recruits ever wanted to be. His office was sterile, save for a wall of faded photographs, portraits of soldiers past, most of them grim-faced and hardened. Avery stood at attention, unsure what was coming. "Sit down," he said. She did. "You've caused a bit of a stir." "Knox," he began, leaning back in his chair. "Word's gone around the region. Other bases are asking who this kid is who passed the midnight test clean." She stayed quiet. "I had you pegged wrong," he admitted. "I thought you'd break. I wanted you to break." Avery's jaw tightened. "Not because I wanted to humiliate you," Mason said, his tone lower now. "Because I needed to see what you'd do with that humiliation. Would it define you, or would you burn through it?" He slid a file across the desk. Inside was an offer. An invitation to an advanced tactical leadership course, something usually reserved for third-year soldiers. "You've earned the attention. Now let's see if you can handle the weight that comes with it." Avery blinked. "Sir, I'm just a recruit. No, Mason said. You're a leader, and everyone out there knows it, even if you don't yet. Walking back from that office, Avery didn't feel pride. She felt responsibility. Something heavy had settled on her shoulders, but it wasn't fear. It was purpose. That night, as the squad prepared for another round of drills, Private Briggs approached her. "Hey," he said awkwardly, rubbing the back of his neck. "I was an ass, back during the test. Just wanted to say thanks for not leaving me behind when you had every reason to." Avery looked at him, then simply nodded. "We don't leave anyone behind. That's the rule." Briggs smiled faintly. "Guess I'm still learning." Avery looked around the squad. The faces that once looked past her now looked to her. They weren't just following orders anymore, they were following her. By the third week at Camp Redwood, the chatter shifted again, not about who's dropping out, but about who would make the War Games team. It was a prestigious competition, part simulation, part strategy, part survival, and every year, the top-performing soldiers from bases across the country were selected to represent their units. The event tested leadership under pressure, split-second decision-making, and the ability to command with clarity in chaos. Only 5 recruits from Redwood had ever been invited in the past decade. Most were veterans. None were rookies. So when Colonel Mason announced the short list for this year's selection, no one expected to hear. "Private Avery Knox, step forward." The yard fell silent. Avery didn't move right away. For a second, it felt like a mistake, a name called in error, but the look in Mason's eyes confirmed otherwise. She stepped forward, eyes forward, back straight. "Congratulations," Mason said, handing her a sealed envelope. "You've been nominated for War Games Command Trials. You'll report at 500 tomorrow." Murmurs rippled through the formation. Avery Command. That was unheard of. Even Sergeant Ramirez looked stunned. That night, in the dim light of the barracks, Private Lily Archer leaned over to her bunk. "Don't let them rattle you," she whispered. "They'll be gunning for you harder than ever now." Avery nodded. She knew Archer was right. This wasn't just a test. This was war without bullets. At Oro 500, Avery reported to the war room, where 6 recruits from different bases had gathered. All of them were older. All of them had combat experience or had at least completed live field training. She was the only one with the word recruit still stitched on her uniform. General Briggs, yes. The father of Connor Briggs was running the trial. He didn't believe in favoritism, and he certainly didn't offer second chances. His eyes scanned the group, pausing on Avery a moment longer than the others. "You've all been chosen because someone thinks you have what it takes to lead under pressure," he said. "Today, we find out if they were right or dead wrong." The challenge was simple in description, brutal in execution. Each recruit was given a squad of actors trained to behave like real soldiers, complete with flaws, egos, and insubordination. Each leader had to guide their team through a series of unpredictable missions, rescue operations, tactical withdrawals, resource management, and live decision-making under pressure. They weren't being tested on knowledge. They were being tested on influence. Avery's trial started with chaos. Her assigned team immediately pushed back. "You're too green. We don't take orders from kids. Where's your combat record?" She didn't raise her voice. She didn't try to dominate them. Instead, she listened. "You're right," she said. "I don't have combat stripes, but I've walked into fire before and I brought my team out whole. You follow me, or you get left behind." Her tone was calm, but it cut deep. The actors didn't stop challenging her, but they began to follow. Through the simulation, Avery made calculated decisions. She didn't take the obvious routes. She risked her team splitting into pairs to flank an enemy camp. She diverted limited supplies to save a virtual civilian. She even lost a mock objective intentionally to preserve her squad. The judges were watching every move. In the final scenario, Avery faced a choice. Leave a wounded team member behind to complete the mission on time or carry them, risking failure. She chose to carry. They crossed the finish line seconds too late. When the results were read, Avery braced herself for disappointment. General Briggs stood before them, unreadable as ever. 3 of you completed the mission in time. 2 of you lost half your squad in the process. He turned to Avery. 1 of you failed the mission, but kept every soldier alive. A long pause. Private Knox, you didn't win today, but you led like a soldier. And sometimes, the Army needs more than victors. It needs guardians. He held up her file. You're accepted. When she returned to Camp Redwood, the news spread like wildfire. Avery Knox, a no-name recruit from nowhere, had made it into War Games Command School, against all odds. She didn't gloat. She didn't even smile. But for the first time since arriving, she walked through the base not as a shadow but as a symbol. War Games Command School was nothing like Camp Redwood. There were no barked orders, no punishment runs, no theatrics meant to break spirits. Instead, there was silence, intensity, precision. Here, failure wasn't shouted at, it was documented, dissected, and drilled into your bones. For Avery Knox, it was a different battlefield altogether. Her first week, she was surrounded by decorated cadets, soldiers with years of experience, some with battlefield scars, others with medals tucked in folders they never spoke of. And then there was Avery. No stripes, no history, just a reputation built off grit and a gut instinct that never backed down. But here, instinct wasn't enough. On her first day in a live simulation room, she froze. It was a hostage rescue scenario. Controlled, yes, but realistic enough that sweat trickled down her spine. Her squad looked to her for the call to breach the door, to divert the threat, to make the move that would either save or doom the hostage. She hesitated. The hostage was killed. After the scenario ended, the instructors said nothing. No scolding, no sarcasm, just a clipboard with one line. You have the voice. Use it before someone else pays for your silence. That night, Avery barely touched her food. The sting of failure wasn't new, but this one cut deeper. She wasn't just letting herself down anymore. She was letting down the image people had started to believe in. She stared at the ceiling of her bunk, her mind replaying the hesitation over and over. But then came the whisper of memory, her own words. Days ago. I didn't come here to be dry. I came here to be dangerous. Not reckless, not impulsive, but decisive. She got up before sunrise the next morning, ran extra laps before training, reviewed maps and urban tactics late into the night, and asked questions, lots of them. She found the quietest instructor on base, a former Special Forces captain named Keller, and asked for feedback. Not praise, just raw, honest critique. He didn't hold back. You think leadership is about being right, he said. It's not. It's about acting when everyone else freezes. Being wrong is survivable. Doing nothing isn't. From that day on, Avery changed. She wasn't the fastest. She wasn't the strongest. But she became the clearest voice in the room. When others fumbled with strategy, she drew new ones. When her team scattered in confusion during a surprise ambush drill, Avery took control calmly, quickly, effectively. She began trusting her instincts again, but now they were refined with knowledge, sharpened by mistakes, and anchored in purpose. In one of the most challenging tests, a 48-hour endurance mission across rough terrain with limited supplies and zero radio contact, Avery led her squad through a collapsing ravine, saved one member from hypothermia, and navigated by moonlight to the evac point, hours before the deadline. This time, there was no fanfare, just a slow, silent nod from the commander as she stepped off the chopper. It was enough. By her 6th week, something strange happened. The very cadets who once dismissed her now started mirroring her behavior, briefing like her, adjusting tactics based on her decisions, quietly falling into her rhythm during drills. One night, she found herself in the war room with Keller again, debriefing their latest mission. He glanced up from his file. "You remind me of someone." Avery tilted her head. "Sir, my daughter," he said, almost a whisper. "She never made it out of her last deployment, but she led like you, never the loudest. But always the one people followed when the storm hit." Avery said nothing, but that moment carved itself into her. Because for the first time, she wasn't just surviving the system. She was becoming part of its future. By the end of the program, Avery Knox stood in front of the graduating class invited, not assigned to say a few words. She didn't use big speeches or quotes from generals. She said simply, "I used to think leadership meant being the strongest voice in the room, but now I know. It means listening when others are afraid to speak, acting when others freeze, and carrying the weight even when no one sees it. If you can do that, then stripes don't matter. Medals don't matter. What matters is that you didn't walk past the fire. You walked through it." The room was silent. Then thunderous applause. Avery didn't smile, but inside, she knew she wasn't just a soldier now. She was a leader, the kind she never thought she could be. 6 months had passed since Avery Knox graduated from War Games Command School. Most thought she'd move on to a classified assignment, or be posted overseas, or even be fast-tracked into a high-ranking unit. And maybe one day, she would. But that's not where she went first. Instead, Avery returned to the place where it all began, Camp Redwood. The base looked smaller now, less intimidating. The buildings hadn't changed, but she had. When she stepped through the gates, no sirens blared, no one lined up, just the steady rhythm of new recruits running drills, the sharp whistles of instructors, and the same gravel crunching under her boots. Except this time, she wore a new patch on her shoulder, one that marked her not as a recruit, but as a leader. Colonel Mason stood near the field, clipboard in hand. He didn't look up at first, but he didn't need to. "I heard your transport came in this morning," he said without turning. "I walked the last 2 miles," Avery replied. He glanced over. "Of course you did." There was no ceremony, no speeches, no applause. But when Mason finally met her gaze, there was something else: respect between warriors, the kind earned, never given. "I've got a squad that needs real leadership," he said. "You ready to build what someone once built in you?" Avery nodded, always. Later that day, she stood before a group of wide-eyed recruits, some no older than she had been on her first day. Some looked scared, some overconfident. One of them, a quiet girl in the back, reminded Avery of herself. She stepped forward. "No long speech," she began. "You're not here to be comfortable. You're not here to be liked. You're here to become something most people never even dare to imagine unbreakable." She paused, letting the silence settle. "You're going to fall. You're going to fail. You're going to want to quit. But if you stay standing, if you get back up, even when it doesn't seem worth it, you'll find something bigger than pain. You'll find purpose." There was no applause, just a new kind of focus in their eyes. That night, as the sun dipped below the hills and the sky burned with gold and orange, Avery walked the perimeter alone, as she used to do. But now, she wasn't avoiding people. She was watching over them. From a distance, Private Lily Archer spotted her and jogged over. "Didn't think you'd actually come back," Archer said, handing her a canteen. "Most people who leave this place never look back." "I didn't come back for the place," Avery said. "I came back for the people who haven't been seen yet." Archer raised an eyebrow. You really think one person can change that much? Avery looked out at the training field, where recruits struggled, yelled, fell, and stood again. I don't think it, she said quietly. I know it. Word of her return spread quickly. The new recruits began calling her the Ghost Commander, a callback to her old nickname, now reborn with reverence. To them, she was a myth walking among them, proof that greatness didn't need fanfare or fame, just quiet strength, relentless will, and a refusal to break. And one evening, as she stood on the steps of the barracks, the wind carrying dust and echoes from the field, Colonel Mason stepped beside her. You remember when I dumped that bucket on you? He asked. Avery smirked slightly, hard to forget. I thought that moment would break you, he said. Instead, it became your origin story. Avery didn't reply right away. Then she said, Sometimes people don't need to be rescued. They just need to be seen. That bucket didn't break me. It showed me I was still standing. Mason nodded, quiet for a long moment. We need more leaders like you. No, Avery said, eyes fixed on the horizon. We need to create them. And with that, Avery Knox became more than a soldier, more than a leader. She became a mirror for every quiet recruit who thought they weren't enough, for every underestimated voice, for every soul that didn't quit when the world told them to fall. Because true power doesn't come from proving others wrong. It comes from proving to yourself that you were never weak to begin with. Avery Knox's journey teaches us something that's often overlooked in a world obsessed with loud confidence and visible victories. Quiet strength is just as powerful, if not more. She wasn't the strongest, the fastest, or the loudest. She didn't win every challenge. She didn't command attention. But what set her apart was her unshakable resolve, her refusal to back down when humiliated, her courage to step forward when others hesitated, and her determination to carry others even at the cost of her own recognition. The lesson is clear. Resilience isn't about never falling. It's about rising, again and again, even when no one is watching. If Avery's story inspired you, subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss what's next. Share this with someone who needs a reminder. Quiet strength can move mountains. Thanks for watching. See you in the next story.